The Last of Us fanfiction written by Aster. Chapter 3. Lists. Then. The residential street they stood on was abandoned and lonely. The bodies of the dead lay bloated and stiff. The triage and safe zone were a day behind them. Hello? Anyone home? Tommy, stop! Wait, stop! We'll shoot! God damn it! Shoot him! God damn it! Can't hesitate like that. I wasn't gonna shoot him till I was sure they were sick, Joe. They were sick, Tommy. Real people don't sound like that. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to be sure, Joe.
It was unsettling how they could banter and enjoy coffee when his brother had lost a daughter just a week ago.
When this is all done, we can go back, give her a proper burial. I don't think it's ever gonna be done, Tommy.
Attention, attention. Military has set up a quarantine zone for survivors in Huntersville. Get back in your homes. Hey, look out!
Outside, wild fists pounded furiously against the door. Fingernails scraped and scratched as the infected fought against the 2 inches of wood that separated them from their prey. Now. October the 7th, 2013, 5:15 p.m. The army had set up a winding series of chain-link fences behind the cement barricades and sandbag walls that marked the edges of the Huntersville quarantine zone. Soldiers armed with assault rifles and gas masks patrolled the outer perimeter, while lines of refugees crowded into the zigzag pathways defined by the fences. Dozens of feet shuffled in uneven rhythm as each new person was called forward. The air thrummed with a combination of relief and anxiety, the relative sanctuary of the quarantine zone offset by the grim, dark expressions the soldiers wore around them. Joel and Tommy were waved forward as they came to the front of the line. A soldier gestured towards one of several metal tables that had been set up under a camouflage canopy, where a young private in military fatigues held out a hand as they approached.
An identification?
He said, without ceremony.
Just me,
Tommy replied, pulling his billfold from his back pocket. He flipped it open and drew out a discolored driver's license. The private took it and set it on the desk in front of him. He immediately began scribbling down information into a plain, lined notebook. After a second, he looked up again and handed back the license as he pointed at Joel.
You're related.
Brothers. Tommy nodded.
Name?
Joe.
The soldier looked down again, scribbling across a new line.
Joel and Thomas Miller. Brothers.
He muttered, loud enough for them to hear and correct any inaccuracies.
Hometown, Perkins, Texas. Thomas.
He continued, pointing at Tommy as he read.
Date of birth, January 5th, 1988. Height, 5 feet, 11 inches. Weight, 205 pounds. Eye color, brown.
Finished, he looked up at Joel expectantly. Joel cleared his throat.
6'2", 220, brown,
he said stiffly. The soldier jotted down the information.
Birthday?
September 26, 1984.
The scribbling stopped for a moment, and the soldier looked up with raised brows, the first real hint of emotion he had yet displayed. He regarded Joel for a moment, then snorted softly.
Happy birthday to you,
he said with heavy irony. Joel did not reply. The soldier stared at Joel a second longer, then pointed at the bandage over Joel's shoulder.
What happened there?
Gunshot,
Joel muttered.
some crazy idiot with a rifle.
Yeah, we have a few of them. Somebody stitched you up?
We were at the triage in Leyland for a few days, Tommy offered. That caused the soldier's eyes to widen abruptly. He looked between Tommy and Joel as if expecting some further explanation. And when none was forthcoming, he leaned forward.
When? When were you there?
Tommy felt the pit of his stomach grow cold with apprehension.
About 6 days ago,
he said quietly, tone prompting the soldier to explain.
Oh, damn.
the young man said with a heavy shake of his head.
You got out before everything, damn. Shit hit the fan. Few days ago, they called to say they were infected in the triage. Ain't heard nothing since then.
Tommy glanced sideways at Joel, but his brother's face was dark, eyes cast down as if unsurprised.
They say how infected got in?
Tommy asked, turning back to the private. The young soldier nodded.
Spores.
He replied. He continued as Tommy's expression turned quizzical.
It's a fungus, they think. Puts out spores like mushrooms. You breathe them in, you get infected, just the same as if you'd been bitten. Leland was letting folks without bites, but they started turning anyways.
He sat back, shaking his head and rubbing at his tired eyes.
We had some of that a few days ago, but nothing we couldn't handle. We ain't taking any chances now, thought. You will get a medical exam, then go into a quarantine area for a few days before we let you into the main zone.
The private began rustling papers as if finished interviewing them, but Joel shifted suddenly, clearing his throat.
We've been off the grid for a while.
He said quietly, his tone losing some of its edge.
They saying how many folks got this thing?
The soldier looked up, lips parting as he slowly shook his head. He made a small disbelieving sound.
Millions, man. Millions.
With the ominous comment hanging in the anxious air, they were waved forward to an uncertain future. November 23rd, 2013, 10:24 a.m. The crowd rocked back and forth as people jockeyed for better positions, pressing forward into the mash of bodies, slowly forcing their way towards the front. On one side of the crowd stood a squat white building with a garish blue plastic sign that read Astro Mart. Bordering one side of the abandoned supermarket's parking lot was a long brick wall papered with dozens of posters and signs. It was towards this that the crowd was making its slow push. Word had gone out early that morning. There was a new list from the Austin quarantine zone. The Austin list stood out from the others, by far the longest of the many papers that covered the brick wall. There were lists for other quarantine zones as well, posters with the names of people who had been identified as present within those zones, but none were as long as Austin. A frenzy of excitement had accompanied the announcement of a new list from the capital, as distraught relatives had rushed to see if this most recent list contained record of the loved ones whose fates were unknown. It was a welcome relief from the clinging dread that had settled over the Huntersville zone since the announcement 3 days previous that a quarantine zone in a nearby town called Jarrett had been overrun by infected. Tommy had spent 3 hours slowly pressing forward with the rest of the crowd, waiting for his turn to check the list. He was close enough now to see the rows of dirty paper, each page smudged by hundreds of fingers running down the list of names. To prevent a crush of desperate refugees, soldiers were only allowing small groups of people to push right up against the posted lists. As several hollow-eyed people drifted away from the wall with hopeless expressions clouding their faces once again, a soldier gestured Tommy and 3 others forward. His pulse quickening, Tommy approached the wall, choosing one of a dozen posted pages to begin scanning. Now it was his grubby fingers that smudged the sheets, carefully touching each name as he searched for any that were familiar. Empty hope began to squirm in the pit of his stomach. No names jumped out at Tommy until he had begun scanning the 3rd page of names. Tony Haberly. Tommy's finger paused and he made a face. Well, that figured. That bastard had crossed more than one picket line to work for less than Tommy's own union men. Anything to survive then, anything to survive now. Tommy shook his head and silently berated himself. What did it matter anyhow? That life felt like a dream now. It was hard to remember why picket lines had once seemed so important. He resumed running his finger down the list of names. Several sheets later, Tommy again paused on a name, and this one involuntarily caused his breathing to quicken and a small smile to jump across his face. Bonnie Hops. An image of the petite waitress leapt to mind,
Her mousy brown hair.
pulled back messily as she hopped across the checkered floor of a snug little diner in Perkins that Joel and Tommy had frequented for dinner after work or on the weekends with Sarah. Bonnie was a sweet gal. She had frequently teased both brothers that one day she would convince one of them to take her out to a proper restaurant. Tommy suspected Joel had more than once been tempted to take her up on the dare. It was nice to know someone who deserved it had somehow survived and made it to Austin. It took Tommy another 10 minutes to get through the remainder of the lists. There were hundreds of names. Hundreds of people who had been confirmed safe inside the Austin QZ. But in the end, only those two were familiar to Tommy. Still, that was better than most could hope for. How many thousands of names would remain black holes, never appearing on any list?
How many millions? Tommy took a deep breath and pushed the thought from his mind.
He turned away from the wall and nodded at a nearby soldier, indicating he was finished.
Others rushed forward almost immediately, jostling Tommy quickly away from the wall.
He found Joel waiting for him at the far edge of the crowd that had gathered in the parking lot. Joel had not joined the crowd, however. He stood leaning against an abandoned shopping cart holder, idly fiddling with the buckle on an old backpack.
Joe,
Tommy said as he approached. His brother looked up, brows lifting expectantly. His expression was guarded, but his tone was hopeful.
anyone?
Tommy nodded once and Joel straightened, putting aside the backpack he had been fingering.
No family.
Tommy said quickly. Joel's shoulders dropped with the same sense of resignation and hopelessness that had crept back over Tommy as he had read the lists without finding mention of even a single relative.
But two others. Tony Haberly's alive. Kinda figures, I guess.
Joel's expression darkened and he frowned at the ground. Tony Haberly had once been the source of one of Tommy and Joel's most explosive arguments.
When Joel had threatened to cross one of Tommy's picket lines with Tony,
if it meant being able to afford a new soccer jersey and cleats for Sarah. Joel had stormed out of Tommy's house in a cloud of rage. In the end, Joel had not crossed the line, but that hadn't prevented the two brothers from refusing to speak to each other for a month. Tommy again felt that hollow sense of irrelevance, astounded at how much that had all seemed to matter once. He continued, brightening a little.
But you know who else is in Austin? Bonnie Hops from France.
A smile crept into Joel's expression as he looked up, now likewise vaguely brightening. The memory of Fran's Place, with its awful green leather booths and 21 flavors of pie, was enough to lift even Joel's abiding dark mood.
That right.
He said softly, smiling to himself now as he shook his head.
Good for her, that's real good for her.
He continued smiling a moment longer, but slowly the brief elation faded from his demeanor. The familiar air of brooding indifference crept back into the set of his jaw and the slouch of his shoulders. He sighed, lifting his pack over one arm.
Come on.
He turned away from the milling crowd, heading in a direction that would take them away from the center of the Huntersville QZ. Huntersville had been a large town, characterized mostly by the sprawl of wide streets and open spaces punctuated by standalone businesses. But at the town center was a roughly half-mile square cluster of old brick buildings and gentle row houses with whitewashed faces, most of which had long ago been converted into small business spaces. It was around this more defensible cluster of buildings that the perimeters of the QZ had been erected, comprised mostly of cement barriers, sandbags, and a hodgepodge of wood and cinder blocks. The Astromart, once an old bottling facility, had become an unofficial gathering place for the hundreds of refugees sheltering in Huntersville.
You're gonna have to pick up your own ration cards from now on,
Joel said as a change of subject, once they were moving away from the Astromart and in the direction of a row of old businesses that had been converted into communal housing.
Why?
Tommy asked, looking sidelong at his brother.
They won't give 'em out to friends or family no more. Said they've been getting folks trying to take cars that don't belong to 'em.
Tommy frowned.
They've seen us together enough to know who we are, though. It don't matter.
Joel shrugged.
Said no exceptions. And bring your paperwork with you too. No QZC, no ration cards.
Jesus, place is turning into a goddamn military camp, Tommy said, glaring at the ground and fingering the quarantine zone card in his pocket, with his personal information scrawled across it by hand. As usual, however, Joel only shrugged again.
Just don't make trouble about it.
They had left the supermarket parking lot behind, but throngs of people continued to gather in idle groups in doorways and on the front stoops of the buildings they passed. A sense of vacancy lingered everywhere, from the emptiness of an abandoned attorney's office and engraver's shop, to the blank expressions of the teenagers playing cards on an old cardboard box outside the town's deserted post office. Again, that creeping dread gnawed at the edge of Tommy's mind, to see the ordinary everyday thrown into stark relief by the hollow faces and idle aimlessness of hundreds of refugees. Never had Tommy felt so alone in a place so crowded.
Stop it.
Tommy heard Joel mutter to his side. He glanced sideways in question.
What? Let it go, Tommy.
Joel grumbled without looking at his brother. His tone was not sympathetic.
Stop looking around the place like that. You keep thinking about how it all used to be, you're just gonna get yourself killed.
Tommy made an annoyed face, pressing his lips together to bite back a testy retort. He settled for snarky instead.
That your idea of a pep talk? Guess so. Really rousing. Thanks.
Joel stopped in the middle of the street and turned to Tommy with a scowl. That's how it was with Joel these days. He had always had a temper when pushed too far, but it seemed to simmer just beneath the surface all the time now, stoked by even the mildest irritation. Joel's dark brows drew together and he thumped a fist against Tommy's chest.
Grow up, Tommy. You want a pep talk? Stay alive. Get your head back on and stay alive.
Nice, Joel. Real nice. That's real helpful. Joel shook his head and glared like he was talking to a child.
Then change the world, Tommy. Go on. Let me know how it goes.
He reached into his backpack and pulled out a sheaf of papers, which he shoved into Tommy's chest. Tommy reached up and caught them before Joel turned and started walking away again. Tommy glanced down at the papers in confusion. They bore the official army stamp that authenticated every QZC and any other piece of military paperwork that existed in Huntersville.
Hey, what's this?
Tommy said, jogging after Joel, his temper deflated by his curiosity.
That's making us useful,
Joel replied tersely, not looking at Tommy.
I got his places on the barricade team.
Tommy glanced down at the paperwork again, quickly scanning it.
What, guarding them? Repairs. Building them up. Maybe putting up new ones if the army clears out new areas.
Tommy did not immediately reply, but he continued trailing after Joel as he flipped through the papers. They included details about what their new barricade maintenance assignment would entail and instructed them to meet at the Astromart the following morning. Part of Tommy was grateful for the opportunity to be doing something other than aimlessly sitting around, but working near the barricades was not without its risks. The infected still roamed the streets outside the QZ. They traveled in packs, moving with such inhuman speed that some folks had taken to calling them racers or runners. With disturbing frequency, these packs would stumble across the QZ and hurl themselves against the barricades, broken fingernails flailing against the walls of wood and stone. The sound of bombs and explosions outside the zone were common, as the military attempted to draw the infected away from the barricades by distracting them with noise farther afield.
Okay,
Tommy said slowly, still following Joel.
Your shoulder gonna be okay with that?
Joel waved a hand dismissively. The bandages had long since come off, but he still moved his shoulder with a certain gingerness, as if the muscles had not yet fully recovered.
It's fine, and it don't matter anyway. Don't tell anyone about it.
Tommy frowned and his brow wrinkled in question.
Why not? Think, Tommy,
Joel replied, tapping his temple and giving Tommy a belittling big brother look.
We can be the guy with a bum shoulder and the guy who mosts about the way things used to be, or We can be the two brothers who the bosses around here count on to get things done. Which ones you think will keep getting their rations if things ever go real bad?
Jesus, Joe, Tommy snorted, clearly taken aback.
You start talking like that, we've already lost. The only way we beat this thing is working together.
His brother almost grimaced, as if embarrassed to hear Tommy talking so optimistically. Joe shook his head, and his voice lowered to a derisive mutter.
This ain't some union, Tommy. Ain't anybody here's gonna stick together when push comes to shove.
Tommy came to a slow halt with a disturbed expression, eyeing his brother. But Joe just turned away and continued walking. Tommy did not follow him. November 23rd, 2013, 8:20 p.m.
Bonnie, saw your name on the Austin list. Hope you're okay. Joel and me made it out of Perkins. We're in Huntersville. We've been here about 2 months. Joel got shot once, but he's okay now. We're joining the barricade crew tomorrow because we're tired of sitting around. How's everything in Austin? Hear about anyone else from France or Perkins? Sure hope you're okay. Good to see a familiar name on the list, finally. Tell us how you're doing. Joe and Tommy Miller.
Tommy looked up, cocking an eyebrow towards the army cot on which Joel reclined. The pale white light of the battery-powered lantern threw awkward shadows across Joel's face, but his eyes gleamed as he turned to look at Tommy, nodding.
It's good.
His voice thick. He lay with an arm drawn up under his head, absently staring up at the ceiling as Tommy had been writing. Around them, the former cafe teemed with people similarly set up on cots in disorderly rows. The evening had brought relative quiet, but half a dozen lanterns still lit the place. The cafe was situated right on the edge of the Huntersville QZ, and Tommy and Joe had been assigned cots on the second floor. Through the quaintly paneled windows, they could see the glow of the barricade lights below.
You wanna add anything?
Tommy said, tapping the tip of his pencil against the back of the receipt slip on which he had written the note. His brother shook his head, turning back to look up at the ceiling.
No, that's good. Tell her to look after herself.
Tommy bent over the paper, balancing the receipt book on his knees and scrawling, Take care of yourself, under their names. He read the note through again and paused. He glanced up at Joel for a second, then hunched back over. P.S. Sarah didn't make it. Hope you didn't lose anyone.
When are they taking these to Austin?
Joe asked quietly.
Whenever the military goes next.
Tommy answered, folding up the note and taping it shut with the roll of dispenserless Scotch tape they had found at the abandoned post office a few days previous.
They're taking letters to some of the other zones too, or to Austin, so Austin can take them to the other zones. That's what a couple of the soldiers at the Astro were saying. Austin got a whole shitload of military stuff. They're trying to get some of it out to the smaller zones, to build them up. Don't want another Jared.
Or Leland.
Tommy nodded. He bent over the folded receipt slip and wrote, as clearly as possible. Austin. 2 Bonnie Hobbs, formerly of Franz Place, Perkins. From Joel and Tommy Miller, Huntersville.
She'll probably be glad to hear from someone from home,
Tommy said, a ghost of a grin slipping over his face as he reread the note in anticipation of what Bonnie might feel when she got it. Joe snorted, but Tommy noticed a small smile tugging at the corner of his brother's mouth as well.
Oh, yeah.
Joe chuckled, as if suddenly recalling some funny moment at Franz.
I bet she's just been dying to hear from her two most demanding customers.
Tommy grinned, happy to see Joel joking.
Oh, come on. You never know,
he said with mock seriousness.
She could be desperate enough even for the likes of you and me. She might just be on her own, like us.
He wished he hadn't said it almost as soon as the words were out of his mouth. apparently had come naturally, the sort of sarcastic jibe that he'd easily have made before all of this. But desperateness was no longer hyperbole. It was not difficult to imagine that the line cooks and other waitresses with which perky, affable Bunny had once bantered might even now be clawing at the barricades of a quarantine zone, if not already dead. It was abruptly sobering. Joe's smile faded and he lapsed in brooding silence once more, still staring absently at the ceiling. Sighing, Tommy tucked the note into his coat pocket and did not try to lift Joe's spirits again. He leaned over to begin unlacing his boots, but a sudden sharp movement to his right caught his attention.
Hey, where did you get that?
The harsh voice of a middle-aged man Tommy had heard called Gary cut through the tired conversations of the 20-some people who had been assigned cots on the cafe's second floor. Gary was lean and grey, with ropes of muscle standing out along his long, thin arms. He stood over the cot of a younger, red-haired man named Daniel, whom Tommy had spoken with only a handful of times over the past few months. Daniel lay on his stomach and looked to have been idly flipping through an old hunting magazine. Right now, though, he was staring up at Gary with a wary expression, lips parted in silent question. In his peripheral vision, Tommy saw Joe lift his head and look in Gary's direction. Others were doing the same.
What?
Tommy heard Daniel ask quietly.
That?
Gary said angrily. He reached down suddenly and snatched the magazine out of Daniel's hands.
That's what. Where did you get this?
He brandished the magazine as if Daniel had been caught stealing a priceless gem.
Hey man, relax.
Daniel replied with clear annoyance, pushing himself off of his stomach as if to stand.
I just found it sitting around.
Think you can just steal people's stuff like that?
Gary spat. The room had gone nervously silent. Tommy caught the edge of a slur in Gary's voice, suggesting the older man had been drinking.
You're just like them bastards who try to loot my place. You think you can just do that?
Suddenly, Gary lunged forward and pushed Daniel, sending both the young man and his cot tumbling sideways and clattering to the floor. Others were on their feet in an instant. The floorboards shook and squeaked as boots and shoes abruptly hit the ground. Several people were grabbing Gary's shoulders and flailing arms, while others crowded around Daniel, pulling him upright and attempting to calm him as he started cursing and struggled to come to his feet and return the favor to Gary. Shouting filled the tight, tense second floor. Before he knew it, Tommy was standing in alarm, intent upon breaking up the disturbance before it got out of control. But he felt a hand grab his arm before he had taken even a single step.
Tommy, leave it.
Tommy looked behind him to see Joe already on his feet, his expression intense and wary as he held his brother back.
Leave it,
Joel repeated. But Tommy never had a chance to decide whether or not to take Joel's advice. Suddenly, a child's voice rang out above all the shouting, clear as a bell.
Infected. Outside.
The effect was akin to shouting, "Fire!" in the crowded movie theater, save that instead of running for the exits, everyone was suddenly stumbling towards the windows, pressing against one another for a glimpse of the barricades below. Gary and Daniel were forgotten. Outside, the barricades were lit up by a handful of battery-powered lanterns and a solitary floodlight plugged into a humming generator. From their vantage overlooking the QZ's outer perimeter, Tommy could see the darkness outside the barricades teeming with moving bodies. He pressed against the window, switching off the lantern by which he had been working in order to better see outside. Joe joined him, and Tommy could sense the tense expectation that stilled his brother's movements. Soldiers were on the makeshift walls, and they were shouting, gesturing wildly, waving flashlights and flares. Below the barricades, outside the zone, dozens of bodies threw themselves against the crude wood and cement fortifications. But there was something abnormal about their movements. They were too controlled, too rational.
Jesus Christ,
Tommy suddenly breathed out.
they're not infected. They're not infected.
The only abnormal thing about their movements was that they were not moving with the rabid ferocity that characterized the infected. They were pounding wildly against the barricade, but not clawing at them like animals. Tommy looked sideways at Joel.
Why aren't they letting them in?
Joel tapped the window, drawing Tommy's attention back to the street below. Now he saw it. The soldiers were wildly pointing their flashlights not at the refugees clamoring at the base of the barricades, but at what approached behind them. The darkness writhed with a mass of running bodies in the distance, all racing for the desperate refugees who pounded at the doors of the Huntersville quarantine zone.
Oh, dear Lord, let them in. Let them in, please, God.
Someone cried out inanely. The crack of a single gunshot silenced all who stood watching the horror from the second floor windows of the old cafe. Tommy caught sight of the muzzle flash below. A second shot followed, and then a third. And in an instant the air was thick with the clatter of gunfire and the screams of those outside the walls. Tommy could see the horde of sprinting infected slow its rapid approach as the bodies of those at the fore jerked and lurched with the force of bullets tearing flesh. But still the infected rushed up the street, an unrelenting wave of terror careening towards the Huntersville barricades.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
A woman to Tommy's left suddenly began whispering, her voice catching as if she could barely find the breath to get the words out.
They're shooting them. They're shooting them. They're actually shooting them.
Holy shit.
Joel murmured, nose pressed nearly against the glass.
They're not infected,
Tommy said breathlessly, as realization dawned.
They're not shooting the infected, Joe. They're not shooting the infected.
And they weren't, or at least, that's not all they were shooting. Even from above, it was clear the soldiers below were firing at both infected and uninfected alike. Waves of bullets mowed through the refugees pounding at Huntersville's gates, spraying gouts of blood across the grey asphalt of the street. As the desperate refugees turned to flee the gunmen on the wall, they met only the rushing onslaught of the infected. The sound of gunfire joined with the hungry howls of runners and the wild screams of the unfortunate souls caught in between. The street gleamed with slick, red blood. The onlookers on the second floor of the old cafe said nothing. Even those who had initially cried out subsided into silence, mouths aghast with soundless horror as the bloodbath continued below. How long it continued was impossible to say, but when it did finally stop, when the sound of gunfire and the wild shrieks of the infected had finally abated, the silence remained like a clawing poison. It clenched at every heart in the room. Tommy felt Joel move beside him. It was several seconds before Tommy could tear his eyes away from the carnage below, but when he did, he saw the grim look that Joel wore. Joel still stared at the gore beyond the barricades, but his eyes flickered sideways for a moment to steal a glance at Tommy. His jaw was rigid.
So much for working together.
His voice was like gravel.
End of chapter 3. Narration by P.P. Wrights. Full cast list in show notes. We do not own any copyrighted material, neither do we intend any infringement. Please support the official release.